NetSparker, the developers of desktop and cloud-based web application security scanners that enable you to automatically identify vulnerabilities in your web applications and web services. NetSparker scanners employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities with their proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at netsparker.com or email at contact@netsparker.com. Recorded Future. They help security teams make more confident decisions faster. Recorded Future's technology automates broad collection and analysis of cyber threat data and delivers the rich external context you need to understand alerts and emerging threats. With real-time threat intelligence from Recorded Future, security teams respond to threats 63% faster and find undetected threats 10 times quicker. To get started, go to recordedfuture.com/securityweekly and sign up for the Recorded Future Cyber Daily. Every day, you'll receive an email with the top results for trending technical indicators, cyber news, exploited vulnerabilities, suspicious IP addresses, and more. Subscribe today and stay ahead of cyber attacks. Endgame's converged endpoint security platform is transforming security programs. Their people, processes, and technology with the most powerful endpoint protection and simplest user experience, ensuring analysts of any skill level can stop targeted attacks before information theft. Endgame unifies prevention, detection, and threat hunting to stop known and unknown attacker behaviors at scale with a single agent. For more information, visit endgame.com. What? Where are we going? What are we? Oh, hey, we're back. Hi, everyone. Couple of announcements before we get started. Security Weekly is returning to Las Vegas for Black Hat and DEF CON. If you would like to request a briefing, actually, I'm not sure how many free briefings we'll be doing at Black Hat. We've got a lot of activities going on, most of which are opportunities for security vendors to sponsor our shows. Enterprise Security Weekly and this show will be recorded live at Black Hat from our suite at Mandalay Bay. Also, we'll be doing 20 some odd, almost 30, I don't know, a ton of 10-minute interviews with 20-something different security vendors. So
that sounds like fun.
There's that, which is going to be awesome. So if you want to learn more and fill up some of our remaining slots, which are very, very, very scarce at this point, securityweekly.com/booking. Make sure you go there, submit your request today. Also, some of you have told us you're overwhelmed by the amount of content that we distribute. We are working on a solution to remedy that problem so you get notified when we publish content that you're interested in. securityweekly.com/subscribe. Click the button to join the listener interest list, and that will set you up as soon as I get the code working. It's a really long story, but we're working on it furiously every day. One morning this week, my dog woke me up at 2 a.m. I tried to go back to sleep. My plan was to get up at 5, and I put in a couple hours of coding until 7, 8 o'clock when I get up and take care of the rest of the family, right, and then come to work.
There's nothing better than getting up before everybody else and just getting stuff done.
Dude, so I try and get up at 5 every day.
Yep.
Right, and recent events have kind of been, now I'm back in the swing of things. Except I don't know. My dog woke me up at 2 a.m. I went to go back to bed, and then I couldn't. And 3 a.m. rolls around, and I'm like, well, I'm just going to go to work. I'm just going to go write some code. Like what?
A couple extra hours.
And then the next morning, at 3 a.m., I wake up and I'm like, well, I guess I'm up. I guess that means I'm up now. Might as well go to work. And then the next, that night, like I got home from work and I'm like, I really need to go to bed right now. Like I'm way too old to be doing this stuff. In any case, we're working on software to make that better.
So you're already doing a great job of converting your sleep schedule to Vegas.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. I don't know what I'm going to do, and I don't know what my sleep schedule is going to be like. I don't know what's going to happen.
It seems like every year I get there on like Wednesday, and then there's always like a big party Wednesday night that starts at, 10, 11 o'clock, which to us...
Wait, when I wake up at 5 a.m. and
yeah, it's the opposite.
In Vegas time, it's going to be 8 a.m. No?
5 a.m. Vegas time is 8 a.m. here.
It's 8 a.m. here.
Yeah.
So shit.
Yeah.
I'm going to be up really early.
Yeah, you're doing it the wrong way.
I might just not even sleep.
Isn't that how it works?
Yes.
What's the 3-2-1 rule?
Good Lord. Anyway.
Yeah. So it looks like you guys broke out a round table today.
We have, ironically enough, we've got a roundtable, and
Yep.
we're having a roundtable discussion.
How about that?
Jeff, are you ready? How's your sleep schedule going on?
I'm old. I don't sleep.
Yeah. You sleep when you're dead.
What is that? As you get older, you require
Right.
less sleep? Is that just the thing?
I don't know. I travel a lot, obviously, and many times I have to, get up early to catch a flight home.
Right.
So I set the alarm. I don't think in the last 15 years I've ever not woken up before the alarm clock.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know. Usually I'm waking up at 4, 5.
Yeah, like
Occasionally I'll sleep. I mean, 6 a.m. to me is
sleeping in. I don't. I didn't get down to the office till 5:30 this morning, and that felt like sleeping in after this week.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, I feel good. I feel refreshed. This is awesome.
Just like Kramer,
But I
you can
agree.
set
I
the
mean,
mental
especially
clock.
in the summer, when it's still, when it's actually daylight at 5:30. Of course, the days are, it's not getting light as early anymore. Yeah. But it's still nice. I get up and I go putter in my garden because I'm a garden kind of guy, and just have some quiet time. It's nice.
Agreed.
I don't code. I just do nothing.
You just do gardening.
I need to find a hobby. Like, I need to wake up early and, like, go for a walk, like, take my dogs for a walk. And I always tell myself I'm going to do that. But, like, I'm up against the deadline here. Like, I want to get this new – we got a new website to roll out. We got a new listener interest to roll out. We're going to be rolling out a subscription kind of service. I want to get the software to a point where other people can maintain it, and I can go on to write other really cool software for – that's my plan.
Yep.
Anyway.
And just like right now, I'm trying to study for the OSCP.
Yeah.
And then people are like, "Oh, do you want to help me out on this project?" I'm like,
No.
I have no time for anything else. So between that and family time, it's like, no.
Yeah. It has been nice to take a break from having a lot of different smaller projects and just focus on one thing.
Yeah, but your breaks are not the type that you want.
Yeah, but no, I love what I'm doing right now. It's a lot of fun. So
what are you coding in?
Coding in Python.
Nice.
Specifically Flask with SQL Alchemy, which I'm learning is really, really interesting animal and a beast in and of itself. I found myself Google searching for, like, instantiated lists versus regular lists this morning. And I'm learning a lot. Every step of the way, I'm learning. Learning how to rewrite other people's code. That I'm like, that's no, we can't. And that's my struggle. Quickly before we get to the topics is, it's great to have an existing base to work off of. However you believe that's crappy or not crappy, and wherever it falls on the scale, it's still nice to have a base to work off of, rather than writing everything from scratch, which I still think takes longer most of the time. But I've just been learning so much, and it's just been so much fun to do that. But I realize I'm like, okay, I'll write this new and I'll do this, and then it hits like another piece in the code where I'm like, oh, I haven't really looked at that piece of the code base yet. I'm like, that's really crappy. I got to rewrite that. And then you rewrite that. And I do have Jack, our intern, who's 15, who's awesome and just very extreme, one of the most proficient coders I've met for his age. Is amazing still.
And again, you said he's 15.
He's 15.
Yep.
And I have to keep pace with him more so than anything else, and hence why I'm getting up early. But then, like, I'll run into another piece, and I'm like, I got to rewrite that piece of code. And then you rewrite that piece of code, and you get to a certain point, and you get an error or architecture decision, like, get to another piece of code, and you're like, I got to rewrite that method in that object as well. And then, like, it's been like 6 or 7 times doing that. I'm like, can we get to the point where we can make a release and put it into staging right now? Because, like, I'm kind of done rewriting all this stuff right now. I want to move on to the next thing and implement new features.
And how many times now have you had Jack look over code and you just hear him saying, "Who wrote this shit?" And you're like, I don't know. It wasn't me. I don't know.
Mostly, actually, amazingly enough, it hasn't been my.
And then you jump back
code.
in.
I have written code in this. This is the application that publishes all of our stuff that we're building a lot more functionality on to do things like create listener interest, and we're realizing that this is our business, and we're just going to put a lot more functionality into it. Hence, why I've been spending more time with it. But I can't wait to, kind of have other people doing the functional business aspect pieces, so I get to focus on security. I want to implement a vault. I want to do configuration management. I want to do Jenkins, DevOps. I want to do more security related things so I can do more segments on the show. Speaking of segments, let's get to talking about our smorgasbord, as it were, of topics. And I'll just start at the top. And if it turns out to be like all that not that interesting or whatever, we'll just move on to the next one. I think I've got 5 topics to talk about. And I'm sure somewhere in there, one of you or both of you at some point is going to feel very passionately about it and just go off.
What does Jeff not feel passionate about?
I'm passionate about most of them, so go ahead.
There you go. So vulnerability management was the first one that I had kind of plucked out. And these all seemingly kind of sort of, I tried to pick ones that relate somewhat to each other. So vulnerability management.
These are all, to me, these are all variations of a theme. But go ahead.
Yeah. So name 3 tips for a successful vulnerability management program was the first kind of thing on my list. I added, like, how has vulnerability management changed? I don't know that we've taken a step back to talk about how vulnerability management has changed in the past 20 years, given all of our collective experience on it, given many of us have worked for Tenable for some time. Tenable's been a sponsor, for some time. We've interviewed lots of people in vulnerability management, but like as it stands today, like where do we stand with vulnerability management?
Well, it's one of probably the biggest changes that have happened in recent years, probably bug bounty programs, being able to open source, being able to find those kind of things.
I don't know that's an aspect of vulnerability management, Patrick. I would agree. It certainly supplements your vulnerability management program, but more so, I think when you're creating your own software, it's more tied, I think, to product security versus infrastructure security, right? Like,
so are you thinking how much have we changed with being able to actually bake in the security versus some time ago where it was like, let's just get it built, get it out the door, and then we'll worry about security later? Has that changed? Or are we still doing that?
I think that's a different bullet point. I guess there's a difference, so let's draw a line in the sand, between product security. In other words, I'm Facebook, I'm an airline, I'm whatever software as a service website that's providing functionality to users, paid or not, and I want people to find vulnerabilities in my software. I think much of bug bounties are find vulnerabilities in my software. Which, by the way, I would never put one out on the software I'm working on because I would go broke paying out bounties because the security's on the table to be addressed, right? Functionality, then
you worry about it later.
Right now we're the only users of it, but we're going to get that security aspect fixed, obviously, before it goes out.
Paul,
and that's not necessarily the right way to do it. But then there's also, Jeff, so the other side of it is vulnerability management on, basically I'm implementing other people's software on various infrastructure to support the function of my business, right? I run Windows, I run applications, I use someone else's servers in the cloud to implement my functionality, and I have to find vulnerabilities in it. And I think those are 2 different things, and I think we don't spend enough time on product security, I don't think. On this show, we typically focus on IT security or infrastructure, internal security, I guess. More so.
You can say it, network security.
Yeah, it's
kind of what
maybe.
That's kind of what it is. What I was going to say, Paul, was, I think it benefits all of us and our listening audience, if for no other reason than to just level set. Please provide us with a basic definition of what you mean by vulnerability management.
It's a good question, and I think for me that definition's changed, right? I was talking to actually Mayhole, who we worked with at Tenable, is now at SaltStack, that really vulnerabilities and patching and configuration of your systems, it's really all configuration management. Like the version of software I'm running and the patch status and the patches that have been applied or not are really just an aspect of configuration. And I really think if we think about vulnerability management, I think it's more about configuration management than managing the actual vulnerabilities. I don't think you really manage the vulnerabilities, you manage the configuration of your systems to be as resilient as possible. And I think that whole landscape has changed as infrastructure becomes software and code, and as we rely less on on-premises solutions and more on the cloud, where it really is all about the configuration of your instance of that software running on someone else's server and network, right? I think that today security is really all about configuration management. And it maybe
All
needs to
right,
change.
so pick up your glass. It is the time of the program where I bring up PCI.
I was hoping to be sooner than this, Jeff. But
Well, I wanted to save it for Vegas. The PCI requirement, the PCI data security standard has 6 major goals, of which are derived the 12 requirements. So one of the 6 major goals is to maintain a vulnerability management program. Within the PCI data security standard, what falls under this thing called maintain a vulnerability management program is requirement 5, which historically is all about antivirus and anti-malware solutions being installed and running and scanning and all that kind of thing. And requirement 6, which is where patching comes into play, which is where having some sort of a risk assessment, risk criteria that you determine criticality of vulnerabilities that are discovered. Requirement 6 also includes things like secure coding and making sure if you're writing applications as part of your business that you're avoiding the OWASP top 10 and things like that. So it's in some ways it's somewhat of a mishmash. But what I have always found intriguing, and I'll put it as a question to you guys, vulnerability management, the way it's presented in the PCI standard, which if you look at the PCI standard as a whole, there's sort of an implied cycle or progression to the requirements. First build a secure network, then build secure systems, then secure your data, then maintain a vulnerability management program, which loosely means keep everything secure that you just put out there, which sort of ties into what you were saying about it's really about configuration. In as much as vulnerability management is supposed to be, and the requirements that are in there are things like, make sure you know what's going on in your systems and make sure you're keeping abreast of vulnerabilities that are published pertaining to the operating systems and applications that you deploy with your environment. I have an opinion on this, but I want to put it as a question to you guys. How do you do that? How do you as an organization keep on top of just knowing what vulnerabilities pertain to the systems and applications and things in your network? How do you discover them? How do you keep track of them? Let me ask that as an open-ended question.
Sorry, you lost me after PCI? What?
Lost me after drink.
You were too busy in your drink.
I was.
So
how
do you keep track of all the different vulnerabilities that you need to keep track of and find out about?
All right. So
one of the easy ones should be let the vendor tell you, no?
Could be. I think that it's a couple of different ways to slice it and dice it. One is if you have your own software that you're deploying, or you're deploying regular, I guess it really is if you have your own software that maybe uses other people's libraries and software.
Mm-hmm.
There are very well documented and very well established ways to understand all of the libraries and everything you're using, and be able to multiple ways to tell you if you're using other people's software that's vulnerable, right? If I've included a library or I'm on some type of framework and that version is vulnerable, that largely has gotten more automated. For example, when I check my project into GitHub, it will tell me, hey, we looked at your Python requirements file or whatever, I'm assuming it goes across multiple languages, but like basically you're using a library for XYZ that has a known vulnerability and you probably want to fix that, right? So I think one thing that's happened and changed is vulnerability management has been baked into a lot of other types of systems, right? in code being one of them. To go back to the Equifax example, when we look at that vulnerable framework, if you're using these more modern systems, it should be really easy to tell you that, hey, look, you're deploying this application, and by the way, the version of the whatever framework, Struts, for example, that you're using has known vulnerabilities. Like, that's no secret. It's not even really all that difficult to tell you that you're using that. I mean, you could probably write or script something yourself to say, when I'm deploying the software, go check everything that I'm using, the app, the operating system, the container, whatever it is, and tell me if there was anything vulnerable in that. I think that's really changed the landscape in terms of vulnerability management, in terms of when you're deploying things yourself, right? Now, when you go to the infrastructure side, I think it's slightly different. I have Windows systems deployed. They have software running on them. It's not in a DevOps style, process. I've got 10,000, 100,000 different desktops that are all running software. How do I know when I've deployed something that's vulnerable? Software has, again, really evolved to be able to tell you that that you're running that vulnerable software. Patch management or vulnerable, I don't know how you term them. For example, like we used Automox as a sponsor. We use Automox, right? And once you get the Automox agent on the system, it tells me like all the software that's running on there that's vulnerable. It's no secret, and if it's vulnerable, you patch it. I don't know what the original question was, but
no. The original question is, how do you discover vulnerabilities? I mean, if you need to manage them, how do you discover the ones that you need to manage?
Right.
And,
so those are two examples of how you do that. I think that the third is a more traditional approach where, to me, this is where like unit testing or testing in some capacity, right? I could have the greatest DevOps tool chain that's telling me about vulnerable software. I could have the greatest patch management style system that's telling me about all the missing things. There's so much complexity in that I need that other check that I think traditional vulnerability management brings to the table, in that now I want to go do my QA or my unit testing /QA, and I want to go check, right? I want to have something else going in, looking at all my 10,000 or 100,000 systems and going, yeah, this group over here where you thought you applied patches or for whatever reason, they're still vulnerable, right? So that's the unit testing and QA aspect of deploying either your infrastructure or your code, is that there's something scanning it. Even though in my code I may say, yeah, I'm using these libraries, I've got some checks in place that tell me if I'm using a vulnerable library, I still want something scanning that going, well, when I put junk in that field, like your application completely crashes or whatever, right? And
so let me cut to the chase, because you finally said the trigger word that I'm looking for.
Okay, good. I guess
scanning. When does a vulnerability scanner like Nessus come into play in terms of anybody's idea of vulnerability management? And more specifically, is it appropriate for an organization to rely on a vulnerability scan for discovery of vulnerabilities that they need to do something with in terms of vulnerability management?
Provided it's not the only way you're discovering vulnerabilities. Right. Because there's, in early on in Tenable, these conversations with people way smarter than me, and they're like, yeah, it's really cool because like you can use our product and that's great and find vulnerabilities. However, whatever you can discover on your own through your good, well-defined processes of deploying systems and saying, when I deploy the system, by the way, it's got a vulnerability because there's a patch missing, and in my processes, I'm just going to apply that. You should do that. That should be one aspect of vulnerability management. The second thing is more of that external scanning and testing that goes, something went wrong, or you didn't consider this aspect, or these group of systems, and that's your QA check. And I think especially in today's day and age, you need both, right? You need to have your own processes for discovering, fixing vulnerabilities, and a QA check on all of that to go, did we miss anything, right? Especially you look at large organizations, they've got tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of different devices running all kinds of different software, not to mention immutable infrastructure, cloud systems, virtual machines that are spun up, spun down, containers, whatever, it's more important today to have both of these aspects of going, yes, our process for implementing our infrastructure, our code, our applications has checks and balances, and we've got a separate set that we call whatever, security or IT or a blending of both, that has an extra set of checks on it, right?
So would you be surprised, Paul, to hear that you're actually reflecting what PCI requires in the standard, where in requirement 6, which talks about patching, which is another topic, but it's sort of tied to, what do you do with vulnerabilities once you manage them? You manage them, you patch them.
Right.
PCI requires you to have independent sources for discovering patches, and Patrick had mentioned, the vendor is probably a primary source. Vendors tend to publish, hey, we've got a problem with this version, and now we have a patch, so we go out and fix it. And there's in the old days it was things like Bug Track and Firewalls Digest. There was other sources of vulnerability information that, and of course PCI was written originally 15, 16 years ago. So there was this implication that there's ways of finding out vulnerabilities. You should know what's in your environment. You should be on top of things and have multiple methods of discovering things you should worry about. And then later on, it happens to be requirement 11. They require vulnerability scanning. And I think they do it for much the way you described. It's more or less a safety net. You've got processes in place, but you can't trust everything, and you've got so many systems out there, and there's so many variables and unknowns. Vulnerability scan is a great safety net check to make sure you haven't missed things or to discover the things that you have. I
agree.
Missed.
And the more I think about this, and the more I kind of blend my development background with my security background, with my IT background, it's the same thing when you're writing an application and deploying it versus maintaining an infrastructure for IT and for your business, right? I've got 8,000 lines of code I have to maintain. If I change one line of code somewhere, it's really hard for me to know the impact across the entire system. Now, having said that, I do build in unit checks. I do manually go, check things. I do manually go test things, and I do run automated unit testing. However, when I'm done with all of that, I deploy it to an environment. Well, not yet, but this is where I want to be. I'm going to deploy it to an environment, and then there's going to be automated processes that go, okay, we're going to try and hit the application from the external side. We're going to try and break everything and test functionality. And then there's another process that runs that's going to do some kind of scanning for security reasons. It's going to test cross-site scripting, SQL injection, try putting junk in every field of long values and things like that and automate that. It's going to give me a result and tell me how much I screwed up my software, right? And what kind of vulnerabilities I may have introduced, or maybe that process uncovered as those other processes are updated and more people are adding security checks and functional checks. Same thing when you're maintaining infrastructure today, right? You're going to deploy a new system. There should be automatic checks and balances that go, you're missing patches, you've got a configuration that's a security exposure. Hey, I crashed that system or service by scanning it, or I found this condition, and that happens on an automated basis. That's the only way, especially today, where I can deploy new infrastructure at such a rapid rate that these checks run, tell me I've got a problem, give me the instant feedback, allow me to easily fix it, and move forward. I think the days are gone of stopping everything and going, oh, well, we need to go back and do a bunch of stuff before we, deploy it. We got to fix this, 1,000 page report of vulnerabilities that come from the vuln scanner. That's one of the things that's changed in vulnerability management. I want to know immediately, I deploy a new server, however, a new service, a new application. However, there's some process that runs that tells me something's really bad. Like you've exposed some kind of risk, and either I've taken it down because it was so bad I had to take it down, or I've notified it, and you've got 24 hours to go remediate that before I take it down. And that's where I really think security has matured to, is being part of that rapid process that is deploying new stuff all the time.
Well, here's a question I have for you guys. in terms of what's changed in vulnerability management, in the old days, typically vulnerabilities were not disclosed by vendors until they had a patch. And of course, you get into the whole disclosure, argument, which is not what I'm asking about. In today's world, where there's more bug bounties and there's more sort of ways, more methods of discovering vulnerabilities, how much has there been a shift in terms of sort of discovery of a vulnerability, being the vendor publicizing it versus there's sort of other consistent places to go to discover what's new and what's bad? Does that question make sense?
Are you kind of asking like how much like 0-day kind of stuff might be out there? Because it seems as though the vendors don't really disclose stuff until there is a patch for it.
Well, so that's still pretty much the norm. Vendors don't like to disclose until they have a solution. I guess my question is, how much are we finding out about vulnerabilities, or sort of the general public, the organizations, people responsible for vulnerability management, how much do they have an opportunity to discover vulnerabilities? Are there other sort of, normal public disclosures of vulnerabilities, ahead of a vendor having a fix for it? And maybe it's more of a one-off. I don't know. Is it still the same as what it used to be in terms of pretty much you rely on the vendor coming forth with, oh, we have a vulnerability, but don't worry, we've got the fix for it?
Well, I think there's some security vendors that can tell you about that type of stuff. And I think where that exists is, yes, the vendor that makes the software, hopefully, is aware of the vulnerabilities and has a process to deal with them and notify customers and release fixes. But we've certainly seen where that's isn't the case. A lot of not a lot, but there are vendors that we see every week that there's a vulnerability that's disclosed, and for whatever reason, long laundry list of reasons, probably a whole segment of itself, have decided not to patch it, to not patch it for 6 months, to release a patch immediately, and everything in between, right? But there are, on like the software side, open source software, White Source is a vendor, and there's a whole laundry list of vendors, right, that do that, and some open source ones as well that will look at open source software and use more creative ways to discover vulnerabilities. Jeff, I think a couple of your questions kind of relate to this, right, in that not every vulnerability gets a CVE. There are certain exposures, right, that don't necessarily get a CVE. There are certain updates and patches to software that don't get the security kind of like red flag, right? They're like, yes, we fixed this issue. They may disclose that on Twitter. They may just update the software, say, hey, we got a new version, and fix security stuff, but not even tell you they fixed anything security. Or they may say, yes, includes security fixes, and not tell you anything more, right? Or the other extreme is they could tell you everything that they fixed security-wise and reference CVEs. The point is, that's a whole spectrum of things that happen. There are vendors that look at that for open source software that are going to tell you about these conditions that exist that may not be in a traditional, as we think of it, Jeff and Patrick, as a traditional kind of security vulnerability feed. So there is that, and that's relatively new, relatively in the past 20 years, right? It's a newer kind of concept. It's something that is still very frightening today to think about. If you're just patching all, trying to patch all the CVEs that come about, that there's this whole other thing that you got to worry about in terms of, and a lot of this relates to different modules, right? Like I'm implementing some type of technology or framework, and it's got a plugin or an add-on or a library. And by the way, the person that wrote that isn't maintaining it anymore. There was just one of these with and the Node Package Manager, NPM, right? One of the installer scripts, there's this whole backstory that happened there. Like essentially one developer's account that gets compromised could lead to malicious code being in this. And is that disclosed in a CVE? No, it's not. But
Right.
to Jeff's point, it's a security condition that we need to know about. And I think it's one of the gaps we have today. And there are people trying to close that gap, thankfully. But I think there's still a gap, Jeff.
But I think also to Jeff's original question where he was asking, like, what is one of the channels to find out these types of things? And in my experience, it seems like Twitter is one of the best places to find those kind of things, where it's the public disclosure of either I worked with the company and we did the whole responsible disclosure and they issued a solution for it and here's my write-up, or the opposite where I let them know, I messaged them 15 times, nothing, so here's my write-up on how that thing is vulnerable.
Right.
And that's Twitter seems to be the place where you find those kind of things with the most kind of packaging, with the best single place I think that you can find those kind of. There's probably lots of other places as well, but I think if you're
would say,
just
Patrick,
looking for that, that's where you're
might
looking.
catch flack for this, but I think that oftentimes when that happens where the vendor's not cooperative, most of the time it's not anything terribly critical, right? It's kind of this like esoteric condition that you maybe don't need to drop everything and respond to. Now, sometimes it is.
I think that's all across the board.
But when it is, we typically see it in the news. But
Right.
I mean, to Jeff's point, what is that news feed?
Well,
right?
if it doesn't have a logo, it's not really.
It needs to have a logo, a song, and a dance, and a website, and
Yep.
all that stuff, right?
And its own Security Weekly episode.
But
Yeah.
but if you're a small organization or a underfunded, understaffed organization that's trying to do something right in terms of vulnerability management and having sources of keeping up to speed with the systems and applications you have deployed, saying monitor Twitter, look at Twitter,
Yeah,
that's a little bit daunting to me. Because is there a way to go to Twitter and just do a search on, and how do you know that you need to ask?
Right. And what do you ask for?
And how do you validate that information? Our fake news story that's in the next segment, right? Like, how do you validate everything that is posted on Twitter? Is it real? I mean, if you're a smaller organization, right, and you start monitoring Twitter and you're like, I need to test every thing I see on Twitter that could relate to the software that we have, when first I don't really know all the software and stuff that we have, and secondly, if I do see something, how do I test it? Let me just stop everything I'm doing and build a lab and go test the feasibility and try and get someone else's exploit working if they've even published it, right? That's hard.
So you're talking about patching it.
Final thought on the vulnerability, because we're sort of segueing into patching anyway. Being an old timer DoD trained type of security professional, vulnerabilities to me are not just the technical, not just the configurations and bugs and things that are discovered in software and systems. It's process, it's people, it's the whole gamut. And we don't have bug bounties for bad behaviors and things that we all know that people do wrong, or whether deliberately or not.
Or reuse passwords.
To me, vulnerability management is just such a broad category that we tend to, everything's about automating and we got to have a tool, we got to have a solution to do these things, which I think is why so many companies, will say, well, let's just run the vulnerability scanner and just respond to the results, rather than using the vulnerability scanner as the safety net to catch the things that their processes have missed, which will processes, the great processes, the best processes are always necessarily going to have gaps and things that fall through the cracks.
Well, and to that end, to transition into patching, we've talked largely about discovery at this point.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know what to patch? Like, let's say I can discover every single different exposure and condition in my network. Great. I can't.
Right.
No one can patch all of it. Very few. I don't know. I don't think there's. If you were able to discover every single security-related condition in your environment, could anyone patch it all of the time?
So, in your opinion, if there's a critical vulnerability that, and by critical I mean, something that there's exploits in the wild. There's, if somebody tries it, they're going to compromise, gain access, get data, whatever. It's really bad. Critical vulnerability, and there's a patch available for it. How soon do you think an organization should responsibly be able to implement the patch?
That's the age-old debate.
Yeah, that's kind of
isn't it? Right?
Well, is it more?
It's an age-old debate, but PCI has a number on it. But I was just trying to get your guys' opinion before I throw in PCI.
You can't say PCI anymore. I have no more martinis to drink.
You've got Whistle Pig behind you, and damn it, that wasn't there when I was in the studio. So
yeah, it was not. That's a relatively new
it's Whistle Pig good stuff?
It is. We should hit that next.
Yeah, I mean, you can turn around and grab it while I'm
Jeff had a really good question. I don't remember what it was now because we started talking about bourbon.
My question is, in your opinion, how soon should an organization install a critical patch once the patch becomes available?
I think you have to define what critical is to that organization, right? And
I always see critical as it's going to put you out of business.
Yeah, but that's
it's vague.
It is. Well, it's an aspect of risk, right? Risk also factors in impact and likelihood of something bad happening, right? If we think about it in the insurance context, right? Like most people don't have flood insurance. Like, why is that? Like, someone ran some models and said it's not an economic incentive, and that was very much a risk calculation. How often is going to happen? How impactful is it when it does happen, right? All of those things are functions of risk. When we think about what patches we should apply, really comes down to calculating the risk towards the organization. And that's really hard. What is the risk?
The martinis are making you over. Assuming that we agree on the definition of a critical patch or a critical vulnerability that a patch fixes, and it's out there and it's public, how long do you think an organization should take to install the patch that fixes a critical vulnerability? Assuming that we agree on criticality.
And criticality being it's a very high likelihood that it's going to be exploited, that I've got a lot of that, whatever is vulnerable in my environment, right? And it's extremely impactful, right? So likelihood, I've got it in my environment and extremely impactful. Right. Do we agree that that should be the kind of recipe for criticality?
I agree, but most people just go with the CVSS score or the CVE score. So go.
I just had to open up that can of worms, didn't you?
I did. This whole industry is a can of worms. Admit it.
But I think that's really the crux of the issue, is defining what's critical for your organization. So if we agree that critical is huge impact to my business operations, I've got a lot of it, and the likelihood and even the feasibility or the how easy it is to exploit is pretty low. Like, those factors combined, you gotta drop everything and patch it, right? If it means my business is gonna stop, and not just that, not just aspects of my business, but it's really impactful to my business, it's a high likelihood that condition is going to occur. If you've done the analysis on that in your organization, like, dudes, like, just stop everything and not patch if you can. If patching has the same result as someone exploiting the vulnerability, then what can you do to mitigate the risk short of applying a patch, right? In the meantime, until you can get to the point to patch. So I guess my answer to your question, Jeff, is it's a calculation for every business.
Because it's
and go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I'm just going to double up on what Paul was saying about the criticality to a business like yours here, where what if you have some Windows machine that's not connected to the internet that you look at and it's vulnerable to Eternal Blue? Is that
And
something that's critical to you?
And that's the crux of the issue.
Eternal,
how do you determine all of those factors?
Yeah, Eternal
right?
Blue is definitely a critical vulnerability, but if you have a machine sitting on somebody's desktop that is not connected to the internet, is that critical to you?
Not connected to the internet at this time.
Right.
Well, so, and I would submit to you guys and our listening audience that most organizations out there do not have the infrastructure, the skill set, the experience, the processes in place to make the type of educated, impacting, impact-based, risk-based decisions that you guys are saying are critical to determine how you respond and how quickly you react.
Because I think you and I have probably worked with people who will look at just the CVS score and say, it's critical, we have to fix it. And we've probably looked at them and go, really? Do we really have to fix that? Is that really critical to us?
Right. And that's the question.
But that's the score in the paper.
That's absolutely the question, but we don't talk about and we don't have automated solutions for people to figure out the answers to these types of questions, because they necessarily require organizations to understand all sorts of variables and dependencies, the business operations and the systems and the network and the potential adversaries, and I mean the threats that we were talking about in our prior segment. There's so many factors that pile into making that educated, informed decision. People don't have that. They're relying on automated technology to tell them what to do.
Well, it's a great point. If we go back to insurance, right? Mm-hmm. There's likely some really great data in some huge machine learning type system that predicts the likelihood of, let's say, a hurricane in a particular environment. It takes into multiple factors, right? Time of year, where you live, and can look at years and years of historical data to predict like the likelihood that a hurricane is going to hit your area, factor that into how much you pay for insurance, right? I'm not saying that's how it works. That's just a speculative example, right? It's really hard to do that with security, right? I don't know that we have that level of data, because every exposure or vulnerability, it's not a hurricane, right? It's some other kind of incident in technology. It's not like a predictable weather pattern. It's whatever's opportunistic for the attackers, whatever technology we have today. There's like millions of different factors. And that's what made, to your point, Jeff, like that's what makes it difficult to ultimately come to the decision of how much effort and how quickly do we need to patch any given thing, any given vulnerability that comes our way.
Well, and go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I was going to say, and to bring it full circle, PCI does require an organization to install critical security, patches that solve critical security problems within 30 days of release of the patch. So they do put a number. And most of the organizations that I worked with over the years, they were more of the ilk that you were describing, Paul. It was like, okay, this is really bad. Nobody goes home until we fix it type of thing. Usually the really bad ones are being done within 7 days. And then you've got this big, huge glob of the CVS scores say it's critical, and we have nothing to, in terms of process or any kind of risk assessment or risk ranking is what PCI describes to prove anything differently. So most organizations that are subject to PCI are simply going by the score that pops on the vulnerability scan.
Yeah, but I'll play devil's advocate and use Equifax as an example, and apologies in advance for that. But what if Equifax had said, this Heartbleed vulnerability, holy shit, it's got a logo, it's really bad, no one's going home until Heartbleed is fixed. However, the vulnerability that bit Equifax was Apache Struts. What if they had sounded the alarm and said, first actually discovered it, which is a whole totally different issue. But let's say they did discover it and say, you know what? No one's going home until we patch struts. We're not going to worry about this Heartbleed thing. I get timelines don't work out. There's just examples, right, of major vulnerabilities. But what if they had put their efforts into the thing that actually bit them? But no one really has a crystal ball at the end of the day either. However, what can we do to help improve that process to say, like, maybe you really shouldn't put all of your effort into this new vulnerability that everyone just happens to be talking about? What if you were able to identify the exposures, the risks that are really important to your business, focus on those, even though it meant maybe not patching every single instance of MSO 8067 or whatever the major vulnerability. I mean, there's a laundry list of recent ones, WannaCry, whatever. You haven't done that, but the really impactful ones were, how do you make that decision? I guess that's why people listen to the show, and I really don't have a good answer.
Well, I think it's not that I have an answer. I have an opinion. I think our whole industry is sort of addicted to the vulnerability and the idea that's what security is.
Right.
And I think all of us would agree that in reducing overall risk by reducing vulnerabilities, that's really been the model for the last 20, 25, 30 years, and it's not working. And we can debate the reasons it's not working, but I think we would all agree it's not working. So, and this would be a good transition to our next topic, hunt teaming, is if you acknowledge, if you concede, one of the talks I give, I talk about the risk equation and the vulnerabilities being one of the variables or components that is how you determine risk, and it's what our whole industry seems to be fixated on. And as a mathematical formula, it's considered a variable. My contention is, let's not consider it a variable anymore. Let's consider it, and I'm not a mathematician, let's consider it a constant. It's there. It's never going to be zero, which is what the goal is. What so much of our industry, especially the product side, drives towards. We got to reduce all the vulnerabilities because that's how we do security. Put that aside. Vulnerabilities are there. They're there to stay. What else is there? Let's talk about hunt teaming. Let's talk about what do we do in organizations from a security perspective to, given that there's always going to be some level of vulnerabilities that exist in our organization, in our infrastructure, in our enterprise, what do we do to prevent bad things from happening? Enter hunt teaming. I've introduced it. You set it up. Your question, Paul.
I also, based on our previous discussion quickly, on Enterprise Security episode 139, I interviewed Jack Jones. He works for Risk Lens, but Jack is the creator of the FAIR framework, Factor Analysis of Information Risk.
Okay.
If you liked our discussion, you still have questions about risk and want to delve into that, go listen to that interview. Jack is someone I would consider the authority on evaluating risk in your organization. It was one of, in recent times, the most eye-opening interviews I've ever had on the show. Now, Jeff, to answer your question about how do we find and discover and do hunting, right? I liken that to, like, is it Netflix that created Chaos Monkey?
I don't know if they did.
Right, to test their infrastructure, break things, tell them what they broke, and then they can go fix them, right? Hunt teaming is sort of similar. You want to have a process to go find where your security breaches or security exposures have already been compromised, and then go clean it up and remediate. The problem is, like, what do we look for? Like, how does Netflix's Chaos Monkey know how to go break and, like, what to look for and what, kind of conditions to introduce that would cause some kind of failure or exposure, right? In their case, it's mostly failure, right? So that they can fix it. We need the same thing for security, right? We need something, on the hunt teaming side we'll talk about since we're transitioning, right? We need something that can go find where our defenses have been breached, I'm not saying it has to be super intelligent, but like, I noticed this has been breached. Like, you need to go look into that, right? It's going to tell you like a ton of stuff. How do you know what to look for? That's what data do you feed it so it can make intelligent decisions and do that on an automated basis? Largely, threat hunters have a lot of human interaction, which today we absolutely need. How do we move that to a point where I can find the exposures and I can find where stuff has been breached? So I'm not saying I can find the attacker's malware. I can find the most suspicious behaviors in my environment and flag those. Tons of vendors working on that problem today. Tons of people, really smart people, working on that problem today.
And how much of that type of thing is really going to be about honeypots, canaries, and watching logs?
Well, that's an aspect. I think it's a great point, Patrick. Honeypots and canaries are an aspect of that.
Yep.
I like Haroon's description of that. He's like, look, if you get 1 or 2 alerts per year, we're doing our job, right? But you're likely have more incidents than 1 or 2 per year. So honeypot or canary is a good thing to have because it's low volume and really low instances of false positives, right? But how do you find all that other stuff that doesn't necessarily trip a canary or a honeypot?
Here's where I think, and I might be a tad too philosophical here, but here's where I think there's this sort of paradox, because in our modern technology world where there's so much data going across the wire within organizations, we have to automate. But anytime you automate this general concept of we're trying to discover anomalies, we're trying to discover the abnormal of what is normal network traffic, data transfer, data flow, behavior within our organization. As soon as we automate that, we have to necessarily set up some sort of threshold, boundaries, rules, that trigger an alarm, trigger an alert, trigger an event. There's going to be some sort of threshold that it has to be there. There's no other way. And as soon as you put in a threshold or a barrier, you've got a bad guy, an attacker, that's going to try to figure out how to fly under the radar. I don't know a way to solve that. In the old days, when there was less traffic and there was less data flowing, it was simply a matter of, and in my experience, I met network people that would monitor their network, they would monitor their servers, and they just had that intuitive gut feeling of, something's not normal.
Eventually, you'd find them, even if you had to go back
to Cliff's.
Yeah, right. Cliff Stall, right? Yeah.
It was what? It was like a 50-cent deviation in the bill for the mainframe cycles that we're
only so many transactions, only so much network bandwidth, only so many pipes in and out, only so many servers. I mean, I lived that as well, Jeff, right? Like when we had a couple T1s, like that was a lot of freaking bandwidth back in the day, right?
Back in the day.
1.55 megabits a second or something like that. I don't even remember how much. I'm hoping I guessed correctly. Someone's gonna message me somewhere and correct me. But
it was huge. It was a huge amount of data.
Now today it's not even about like the bandwidth that you have. You've got crap deployed everywhere. I use crap as a loving, endearing term, but you've got crap deployed everywhere, right? Sometimes it's your stuff deployed on someone else's stuff. Sometimes it's entirely someone else's stuff in SaaS that you have accounts to. And how do you do that today? I guess that's really job security for us.
But here's my question that I wanted to ask you, because you presented in our segment this idea of hunt teaming.
Yeah.
And you asked the question in our wiki: what can organizations do to discover breaches more quickly and consistently? My question is, and again, I'm going back to a sort of a PCI bias. Where PCI requires logging and centralized logging, pull the logs off all the systems, and having daily log review. as well as doing things like IDS and file integrity monitoring and other things. My question is, what else is there besides sort of network monitoring, traffic monitoring, event monitoring, log monitoring, the things that are sort of, I don't think there's a whole lot of new things out there, but that's my question. What else is there that sort of fits this category of detecting whether breaches have happened?
Different perspective on that.
Okay.
In the past couple of years, I've worked towards answering this question, Jeff, and I'm glad you asked that. So I have Paul's enchanted quadrants, as I call them, for indicators of compromise. My 4 enchanted quadrants are, you're going to look at the endpoint aspect, some type of endpoint logging, for lack of it, but the endpoint intelligence, right? What's going on my endpoints. You're going to look at your logs, right? What's going on in my logs. You're going to look at the network traffic. You're going to tap your network and look at network traffic, even NetFlow. Cool, right? The 4th quadrant, some people will challenge me on it, but I'll go toe to toe. It's fine, and whoever wins wins. But I think it's threat intelligence, right? If you blend all 4 of those enchanted quadrants together, that's what you're looking at to glean, how do I detect attackers that are in my environment? Now, the other thing that I've noticed more recently, probably I would say in the past 6 to 8 months or so, is that it's very much about looking at behaviors, that you use those enchanted quadrants to somehow intelligently determine what behavior is anomalous. And it's all about looking at behavior. And I'm not talking about the behavior of an attacker that we used to talk about back in the day, in that we looked at the network and we saw an exploit come across because some attacker sent it. It's because today it's about the behavior of an identity, right? Some identity, credential, if lack of a better term, did something that is outside the norm, that behavior is most likely anomalous. And I think that from the attacker side, you've got to emulate as much as you can behaviors that are, air quotes, normal in the environment. Eventually, you're going to have to step out more and more and exhibit behaviors that are maybe a little sketchy and not the norm, right? But that behavior and detecting those subtle variances in behavior between this is something that this identity normally does versus this is something that this identity doesn't normally do, that's where I see more of the innovation in our field in terms of threat hunting, in terms of detection, prevention even, right? Just a great interview with a sponsor where we talked about this, right? And being able to take action on these behaviors is the second step, right? Not so much in hunting, but if you can do hunting well, how do you translate that to, excuse me, this identity is trying to do this thing, and maybe I'm not going to stop it, but I'm going to say, prove to me that that's really your identity, because attackers largely today are really on the network assuming someone else's identity and trying to execute attacks.
So I've got several comments on that.
Let's get comfortable.
Take
we
a
need some
drink.
whistle pig. We need some whistle pig. Someone
Pull the
bring
whistle pig down. I mean, my first is a question: define threat intelligence.
Oh boy.
My second comment. My second comment.
The whole segment in itself.
What you're describing, I think, is the same thing as what I'm saying. Is you're saying, well, you have to get better at discovering that anomalous behavior, that's something that's different. But again, you do that in an automated fashion by coming up with rules and thresholds and barriers
And machine learning and artificial intelligence, Jeff.
And we have an article in our news segment, if we ever get to it, that talks about the bias that's built into it.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's true. You're absolutely right.
But go back to the movie Sneakers.
Great movie. Robert Redford,
the classic
Sidney Poitier.
the classic scene where Redford had to steal, I forget what he had to steal from the CIA, from the bad guy, which was his friends. It was in a protected environment. They had to raise the temperature because they had temperature sensors. So they had to raise the temperature of the room to 98.6 degrees, so that when he entered, that wouldn't trigger the alarm, that wouldn't trip the alarm. And they had motion sensors, so they had to train him to move slowly. These are all very physical examples of whatever the threshold is. The bad guys can learn how to fly under the radar.
Who's the actor that plays the bad guy in Sneakers? Now I can't think of it.
It's
what's his name?
It's Gandhi.
Bald. Yeah, he's bald. No,
Ben Kingsley.
Yeah. Ben Kingsley, and Dan Aykroyd was in that as well.
Yep, David Strathairn.
Many other great. It's a great movie, and nothing's changed from that movie. It's just faster. That's all.
Yeah, sorry, what were you saying about that movie, Jeff? I lost it because I couldn't think of Ben Kingsley.
He's been thinking about that.
What I was saying was, whatever the automation, whatever the threat intelligence is, and I would even say, and I'm willing to artificial intelligence. That sounds intriguing, but it's still, at the end of the day, a computer program that's monitoring activity, and there's some sort of threshold that if you exceed it, you trigger an alarm.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're intelligently learning how to move the barrier or the threshold.
I would say with today's technology, Jeff, that if I try to impersonate someone's voice, that also if the temperature changed in the room, and I forget the name of the character in the movie, but my voice is my password, right? If he was accessing the facility at a time where he normally doesn't access the facility, now if I can't enact any other form of two-factor authentication or biometric authentication, if all those conditions persist that a computer can totally detect today, that I would I would block access until a physical person can verify that person's identity. I would send the security guard down, and he would go, "Wait, you're not what the I'm what's his? Oh, it's in his thing. I'm something, and my voice is my password. Everyone's yelling at me now that's listening to this podcast that has watched Sneakers more recently than I can, and I can't think of the person's name. If Larry were here, he would know the person's name.
Yes, the whole phrase, we should all know it by heart. We should all be members. But if the indicator is he's checking in at 11 when he's never, he's usually leaving at 5, the bad guy can fool the AI by, and it takes time.
Werner Brandes, thank you.
But he could.
My name is Werner Brandes. My voice is my passport.
Well, and
verify me. That's the quote.
We're all feeling better now for you.
Yes.
But I could for a day or a week check in at 5:30, and then for another week at 6, and for another week at 6:30. There's ways to fool the automation.
Right, but that's but one factor, and I think that's the appropriate usage of machine learning. And believe me, garbage in, garbage out. I get the variances, right? But the temperature in the room, the time, maybe I've noticed, maybe the scoring on the voice authentication is plus or minus 5 off than it normally is. That in of itself,
I think that movie
like I could have a cold, and that in of itself isn't an indicator. But those coupled with the time, the temperature, and the voice variances, that together triggers something's wrong. Send someone down in person to just make sure that is Werner Brandes.
And my contention is, whatever the threshold, whatever the measure is, this is a game of cat and mouse, and the technology is more advanced and it's a lot more complicated, but it's still this basic concept of you set the threshold, I'll figure out how to fly under it. So you reset the threshold, I'll figure out a way to fly under it. For the attacker that's motivated and wants to target you, they're gonna find a way to do it, which is one of the paradoxes of this industry as a whole. Is we tend to protect against the casual. You mentioned earlier, I forget whether it was this segment or the prior segment, but most of the hackers out there, most of the bad guys, the perpetrators, are just kind of sort of targets of opportunity. What can I find? What can I do? And we're not really well equipped to go after. No, somebody really wants to go after you. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to go after you. And they're willing to invest the time and the resources and do what they need to do.
Like
to
all those hundreds of thousands of people that are going to storm Area 51.
Exactly. Asset management.
If you've seen
Should people know what they have?
Have you seen that? There's a whole Facebook event. They're going to
Right.
Yeah.
The Naruto runners and...
I know all about Area 51. I just can't tell you about it.
Oh.
All I know is there's like a thing. Anyway, that's all right.
There's going to be a storm
We should have called that security philosophy with Security Weekly. That was great. I love it. That was great. With that, we're going to take a short break, come back, talk about the security news. Stay tuned.